Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's July 17th, 2018, and I could not be more excited to be doing today's interview. Today, we are going to be discussing a super important book that I just heard about in the past few months, but was just able to start really reading over the past week or so. The book is entitled Where We Must Stand, 10 Years of Feminist Mormon Housewives, edited by Sara K.S. Hanks and Nancy Ross. Nancy and Sara have joined us today for this interview. We're planning on it going a little under 2 hours. And the entire purpose of this interview is to discuss this really important book. Before, podcasts were super popular, but after the September 6th, the Mormon blogging world kind of entered the scene around 2004. First with blogs like Times and Seasons, and I think By Common Consent came right up soon after. And right within that time, a young housewife, red-haired housewife from Idaho, decided that she felt like there needed to be a space for Mormon feminists to discuss feminism, and she started a blog called Feminist Mormon Housewives, which exists to this day. But that blog, Feminist Mormon Housewives, played a super important role in kind of the mid 2000s and beyond, in helping to get us to where we are now today in modern Mormonism. And so Sara and Nancy have done this really important work of compiling important essays from 10 years of Feminist Mormon Housewives into this book, along with some brief history, sort of giving us a caption of each year as it progressed. So we are going to be talking to Sara and Nancy today. Before we jump into that, a few quick announcements. We are really excited to announce that we have our first Mormon Stories billboard that is now up along the I-15 corridor. So if you are traveling southbound on I-15 in Salt Lake City from downtown, right around 3500 South, facing north, there's a digital billboard that cycles through various ads, and one of those ads is a Mormon Stories podcast ad. We have plans for expanding this billboard campaign, but for those interested, pay attention to it and check it out. We're really proud of that. We're grateful for the donors that have made the billboard possible. We need a little more support because we're going to be expanding this campaign. You can hear about this in the coming weeks, but for those interested, check it out. In addition, just really quickly, we have several events coming up, Mormon Stories podcast workshops and retreats that are really important for those who are struggling in a Mormon faith transition in their marriage, in their personal lives, with their kids, with their extended family. We're coming to Idaho Falls, August 10th through 11th, Portland, Oregon, August 17th through 18th. We hopefully are coming to Sweden and Switzerland in mid-September. Of course, we have the Bahamas cruise, October 24th through 28th, and then we're coming to Sacramento, November 2nd through 3rd, and early 2019, we're starting to get some events on the calendar. We're thinking about Ogden. We're thinking about South Jordan. We're thinking about the Midwest and other areas. So email us at staff@openstoriesfoundation.org if you have questions about an event or want to plan an event or host an event. And check out mormonstories.org/events if you want to consider or attend any of these events. All right. So without any further ado, it is time to welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast the authors of this wonderful book, the editors of this wonderful book, Sara Hanks and Nancy Ross. Nancy, you first. Welcome to Mormon Stories.
Good to be here.
Now, this is your first appearance on Mormon Stories, right?
Probably. I think I may have been on a panel a few years ago, shortly after the exclusion policy, but I'm not quite sure if that was exactly Mormon Stories. But sure.
It's hard for me to keep track. I've got over 950 episodes.
Sure,
so
yeah.
Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
And Nancy, tell us just a bit about yourself, just so we have a bit of your background.
Sure. I am a professor. I'm an art historian, and I teach at Dixie State University.
Nice. So do you live in Southern Utah then?
Yeah, I live in St. George. Yes,
So you're joining us all the way from St. George.
that's right. Yes.
Well, so glad you're here. And Sara Hanks, welcome as well today to Mormon Stories podcast. Tell us a bit about yourself, and if I think this might be among your first appearances. Is this your first appearance?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I was on. I've been on some podcasts in the ether, in the adjacent to Mormon Stories, but nothing on Mormon Stories itself before. But I was born and raised where Nancy lives in southern Utah, St. George area, and currently live in Layton with my husband and 2 kids. I'm a freelance writer and editorial assistant for like a health food website, and I have been in the Mormon feminist community my whole adult life, and have written for Feminist Mormon Housewives, and just happy to be here. Glad to talk about the book.
So happy to have you. We know you're not from Layton because you pronounce it Layton and not Layton. Is that right?
I mean, that's true. I'm not, but I'm sure that I have I know for a fact that I have my Utah accent, things that come out, especially when it comes to pronouncing things like feel as Phil or deal as dill. So
That's very self-aware of you.
In there. Well, sure.
My producer, Tim, has just let me know that episode 517 of Mormon Stories podcast is called Discussing Gender and Mormon Apologetics with Nancy Ross, Kevin Barney, and Jessica Finnegan. I don't even know. I'm not even sure. I guess I moderated that one, but I'm really sorry, Nancy, for not remembering.
It's all right. It's like 400 and something episodes ago. So.
I'm getting old is the problem. All right. Well, we're really excited you guys are here. Really quickly, I think it'd be fun just to do a tiny bit of biography of both of you. So let's start with you, Nancy. Can you talk about your either feminist upbringing or your feminist awakening? Because not every Mormon woman today self-describes as feminist. So how did you get to become a feminist, Nancy Ross? Assuming that you are, and not just the editor, but
I am absolutely a feminist. Absolutely. So, I grew up LDS. My mother had actually been involved in the Exponent 2 community. And
whoa, that's cool.
Yeah, there actually aren't many second generation Mormon feminists, but that's something that I can claim. She had been on the, had worked on the magazine in the early 90s. So that's pretty cool. And she didn't really talk to me about feminism. I think she was worried about like poisoning my faith somehow, and was very concerned that I was a very zealous young Mormon, and that her feminist thoughts and ideas might corrupt that somehow. But as growing up, I was very involved in the church and very devout, and read the scriptures a lot and did all the things I was supposed to do, but also noticed a lot of things like the young men in the ward, went on these super fabulous trips all the time. And we lived in a fairly poor ward in a fairly poor area in central Maine. And there were just a lot of things that the boys got to do that the girls never got to do. And it was hard to sweep that aside. And I remember being a teenager and asking my dad, like, hey, what's up with that? And he was in the bishopric at the time. And he just told me, like, to keep boys in the church, they just got to do this stuff. But to keep girls in the church, girls just need different things. And I really didn't like that explanation, because I didn't think that the girls were, had different value in the church, or that they should have different value. So I grew up kind of but mostly I kept my questions or issues to myself. I had a lot of positive experiences in the church. I did my education in the UK, my undergrad years and my graduate school years, where I met my husband and had a great experience in church through my grad school years, and felt that the church was a more welcoming place than I'd seen in other places. The Cambridge ward at that time was just a wonderful place to be. But then we finished up our degrees, and I was pregnant, and then we moved to southern Utah. And I'd never really visited much west of Philadelphia. So it was a bit of a shock to the system to move to St. George. And suddenly being thrown into a life of having young children. I have 2 daughters that are very close in age, and a very, very conservative ward in southern Utah. And that was just really ripe for a big and powerful feminist awakening of, hey, wait, this isn't working for me and I need to do something else.
So what year would that have been?
So my kids were born in 2007, 2008. I probably started reading Feminist Mormon Housewives in 2005. Initially it was like a guilty pleasure, and then I kept giving it up. Oh, I shouldn't read that anymore. It's a little scandalous. And then eventually I just stopped giving it up and realized that it was really helpful for me in navigating church and family and situations. And I was also beginning to adjunct and work on some projects at that time, but also feeling a lot of pressure from other people that I shouldn't want to work, even though it was gave me a lot of joy to do things like teach and to do things like research. But I also felt like I should really just hunker down and do the housewife thing. And it just didn't work out all that well. I became involved with Ordained Women as soon as it kind of went live in 2013, and became involved with that board. I was on that first board. And, after the exclusion policy, I ended up leaving the church, even though I tried to hang on for so long, and helped to found a congregation of Community of Christ. And I'm going to be ordained like next week. So, it's a kind of a full circle thing there, but for the 35 years I was in the LDS church, I was very all in until it was just going to kill me to stay in.
Okay.
So
you're a Community of Christ in St. George. I've heard about that.
That's correct. Yes.
That's you.
Yep.
Excellent. And did I hear you right? You escaped the Cambridge ward, not self-describing as a feminist. Is that right?
So yeah, but not Cambridge, Boston, Cambridge, England. So
okay, got it. Sorry,
right, so not like
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Right, like if it if Laurel Thatcher Ulrich had been my gospel doctrine teacher, then that would have been like the best thing that would have ever happened to me ever. But no, I was in Cambridge, England, where we had like a lot of students in the ward, a lot of American military in the ward, and then local English people in the ward. But that was still about my most flexible, moderate church experience, and quite a happy one for me. Got it.
So the year you started reading Feminist Mormon Housewives in pain in the conflict was when?
So I started reading Feminist Mormon Housewives before the pain.
No. I know. I'm saying, yeah. What year was it like painful for you?
So like 2008, my youngest child had just been born. I had effectively 2 babies, and it was a very overwhelming situation.
Okay, I've got the timeline in my mind, so sure. I just want to know when Nancy enters it. Okay. Yeah. All right, Sarah, your turn.
Okay. Let's see. So like I mentioned, I grew up in St. George. I was the oldest of 5 kids in my family, very faithful Southern Utah Mormon family from pioneer stock and farming family. And I too really felt so all in with the church. I loved Young Women's. I loved girls camp. I felt so nurtured and also felt a real sense of my identity being like a perfect Mormon girl, who did all the things right. And so that was a really big deal. There were things, looking back, I can tell there were things that would kind of hint at a future feminism. I was very frustrated by what seemed to be double standards when it came to like dating. Some of my leaders really hammered hard that like boys should pursue, girls should be pursued. And I just thought that doesn't make any sense. What if I like a boy? Like, why shouldn't I be allowed to ask him out? So there were little things like that. But then when I was in college and engaged towards the end of my college career was when the whole Proposition 8 thing happened. And that was really distressing for me. I heard about Proposition 8 completely outside of a Mormon context. I didn't know that Mormonism I didn't know the church was involved at all or had any position on it. And my immediate response was like, yeah, gay people, like, why shouldn't gay people be able to be married and build their lives, and that's a perfectly good option. And so then when I found out that my instincts were at odds with the church, I was like, whoa, like, now I'm not a perfect Mormon girl anymore. What am I going to do with this? But I really tried to like button down did the very, very mature thing of like posting a thing on Facebook about how even though it was so hard to do, I sustained the prophet and was against Proposition 8, even though I didn't live in California, like it didn't have any, I wasn't voting on it, but it seemed really important at the time. And then immediately after that was when I went to the temple in preparation to get married. And that was sort of the tipping point, the temple endowment, which I had looked forward to as this incredible experience that would bring me closer to God and really be an incredible source of spiritual nourishment, was just the worst. I had a terrible experience, and I didn't know what to do with that either. And so that was kind of the beginning of me looking for things like Feminist Mormon Housewives to make some sense of it, because I still really wanted to be in the church, and I really wanted to get back to being a perfect Mormon girl. And I needed some people to show me that it was even possible to stay in the church when you were having a hard time. And so that was kind of the beginning of my relationship there with the Mormon feminist community. And then over time it grew, and this was when Mormon feminism was sort of moving into Facebook as well. And so I was making these incredible friendships, and eventually was kind of recruited to be one of the bloggers at Feminist Mormon Housewives. And that was in 2013. Just a year prior to the 10th anniversary in 2014. And that was when I was like, let's make a book. We've been out here for 10 years. So yeah, that was kind of the timeline for me.
Got it. So that intro that I read, that was yours, right?
Yeah, the preface was from me.
Okay, the preface.
And Nancy wrote one that's kind of more historical, and mine was, here's what it's like to make this book. Got it.
Okay, so let's go way back, and let's give our listeners a little bit of pre-FMH history, kind of a Mormon feminism history in 5 minutes, if that makes sense. So whether that's Exponent or, Sunstone September 6, give us just the primer to set the stage for Peggy Fletcher Stack's article saying, "Where have all the feminists gone?" Nancy, is that you? Because you wrote the history blurbs? Or
Sure. So okay. I would say that a long time ago, Joseph Smith died and Emma Smith didn't go west. And that's the beginning of Mormon feminism.
I love it.
Or at least, there were actually lots of feminist things that happened before that particular point with the Relief Society. But really, her big first act of resistance is to say no to Brigham Young. And I feel like that's an important marker in Mormon feminist history. Mormon women have always, were feminists before they were conservatives. And, you try tweeting that out and you get a lot of nasty responses back. But Mormon women were feminists before they were conservatives, and they were involved in the women's suffrage movement at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And, fast forward a few generations, there were some awesome women who were pretty feministy, like Esther Peterson or Juanita Brooks, or, and various others that had groups that were meeting in Utah. But in the late 60s, the group that would found the Exponent 2 began meeting as a feminist consciousness raising group in Boston. And I believe it was Judy Dushku also belonged to several other feminist consciousness raising groups. And she would bring the materials that she read in those other groups to her feminist group. And many of the women agreed that some of that literature was a little too radical for them. But I believe Claudia Bushman said something like they read it with great interest. And so when the Relief Society publication ended in the early 70s, they kicked off their own magazine called Exponent 2 in 1974. And the movement has really been more of an organized publishing, writing movement since 1974. It resisted the ERA and saw figures like Sonia Johnson and Mormons for ERA. There were other groups like the Mormon Women's Forum that met in Salt Lake. There were groups meeting at BYU. There really have been groups of networked Mormon feminists for about 4 decades.
I love it. I remember, what was the name of the feminist group that Joanna Brooks was a part of at BYU while I was there?
I believe it was Voice.
Voice. And they would hold candlelight vigils, I think, for rape victims. They would protest anti-abortion legislation on the campus. Mm-hmm. Super active while I was there before I identified as a feminist myself. So, Yeah. And then the September 6th, of course, was a really important inflection point for feminism. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, Maxine Hanks edited a book called Women in Authority that was really beginning to take a deep dive into Mormon women's history. And there were some chapters of that particular book that were deemed to be fairly controversial. Mike Quinn had a chapter that was deemed to be fairly controversial, and just the whole project was seen as a bit of a challenge. Because while Mormon women had been writing history before 1992 when that book was published, that I think there was a lot of energy and momentum in that particular publication. And so Maxine...
What was the content of some of those chapters? What were the topics that were trigger points for some of the brethren?
There was Heavenly Mother was a topic, women giving blessings. There was a lot of a history of women's publication, just all these wonderful activities that women used to spearhead on their own in the semi-autonomous relief society. So this idea that women had really held their own power and authority, had claimed their own spiritual power and authority through rituals like blessing, and had really run their own organizations, largely without the help of the men. They raised their own money, ran their own organizations, and wrote their own publications. All of that, I think, and remembering that and bringing that history to the foreground, I think all of that was a challenge to correlation and the direction that the church had been moving in the years after the defeat of the ERA, or the not passing of the ERA.
It's safe to say that, were you going to say something, Sarah?
No, just confirming that Nancy.
Okay. Yeah, it's safe to say that feminism might have been the biggest concern of the brethren during the September 6th sort of fiasco. Is that fair to say?
I believe so. Certainly that's most of the September 6th were disciplined because of their feminist writing. And then we also see other feminists in the years after, like Margaret
Toscano, yeah.
Margaret Toscano, right. And Janice Allred and others excommunicated and disciplined for their feminist writing. So feminist writing seems to have been a real problem for the church hierarchy in the early 90s or throughout the 90s.
So the brethren were super scared of feminism, it appears, up through that point and beyond. So what happens when 1993 comes and goes? What does that do to Mormon feminism?
Well, I mean, there's kind of there's two ways to tell the story, I think. The most simple and transparent would be that it really drove Mormon feminism underground. That when so many Mormon women who had feminist leanings saw this discipline, saw the general attitude of the church being so unfriendly and unwelcoming, women felt like they had a decision to make. Either they could keep their feminist feelings to themselves and remain Mormon, or they could sort of distance themselves from the church and be more authentic to those beliefs. And so over the course of those years, when more discipline was happening and the feminist traditions of Mormon women were sort of being denied, you kind of had the sense that this was not a community that was thriving anymore and creating new material. However, underground, I said it was sort of driven underground. Underground, things were still happening. People were still making connections. There were these listservs, which were sort of the forerunner to, online forums and blogs, where people could connect with each other in email and kind of come up with new ideas, or not even new ideas, but just kind of revisit old ideas with one another.
And keep the fire burning, right?
And keep the fire burning. But the tricky thing about that is you kind of had to know somebody to be invited. It wouldn't be anything that you could just find through a Google search, or that there would be like a public event, that you could go to. It was very much based on relationships, and it was much more private, which I think was important for people's feelings of safety, that they felt like they could say what they believed, but in a way that wasn't going to be published and therefore put them at any kind of risk.
Do we remember any of the names of these internet forums or groups? It's okay if we don't.
Yeah, there was so I recently talked to Lynn Matthews Anderson, who's kind of set a lot of this stuff up. And I think I might get the name just a bit wrong, but it's like the Latter-day Women's Caucus.
Okay.
Or the Electronic Latter-day Women's Caucus, I believe. And I think there were a few other related listservs.
Yeah. I think they call it ELWC. That sounds right.
That's right. Yeah, the Electronic Latter-day Women's, something like that. Yeah. So, but it's important that while we say that, or there's this idea that Mormon feminism went underground in the 90s, that when we actually look at the books that Mormon feminists publish and we kind of track them by decade, there's actually an explosion of Mormon feminist writing in the 90s. And so while there is a lot of fear, and when we say that Mormon feminism went underground after the September 6th, a lot of people, or when in conversations with others, I've talked a lot, or other people have said a lot about how much fear they felt, the fear of church discipline, fear of, creating rifts in families and that sort of thing. But that there were still more outspoken women who were writing very publicly about feminist things, who were not disciplined at the same time. So that's important to also acknowledge, that there's a lot of fear, and there's fear in the community, and that prevents people from acting, but there's still a lot of writing. And these publications really continued through that period. The Mormon Women's Forum, the Exponent, that these were still active periods for those groups.
And what was the annual meeting that kept happening, the annual conference in Salt Lake? Counterpoint, right. And that was Margaret Toscano and who else?
And Janice Allred.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that still goes on now.
Right. Okay, so take us to Peggy Fletcher Stack's article then. Is that the match that lit the Feminist Mormon Housewives flame?
I don't think it was, honestly.
Okay.
I think it's like an incredible, it's a very
serendipitous
coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah. But right, in 2003, Peggy Fletcher Stack wrote an article for the Salt Lake Tribune entitled, "Where Have All the Mormon Feminists Gone?" And she sort of reflected on this history, saying, we had women in suffrage, we had women promoting cultural feminism in the 30s and 40s, and we had this explosion during the women's lib movement. Where have all the Mormon feminists gone? And I believe that it was Claudia Bushman who said in that article, Mormon feminism is dead or dying in this generation.
And
go ahead, Nancy.
No, you finish and I'll jump in.
I think that's just that's a flashpoint that says, okay, this is an indication of where we are, or at least where we are perceived as being, and it's an important backdrop to the creation of Feminist Mormon Housewives.
And I think in that time, I've certainly heard that Peggy got a lot of grief for that article, for not being connected to the areas where Mormon feminism was thriving. But it was happening in these listservs. It was thriving in these listservs, which were not really accessible unless you knew the right people. But what happened is that after the September 6th, and a lot of women will say this, is that their daughters left the church. And so that by the time 2003 rolls around, when Peggy writes that article, there isn't a lot of young blood for Mormon feminist organizations to draw on to help keep publications alive. And so Mormon feminist publications and organizations are really struggling to find new people to kind of take over so that the older generation can kind of retire and move on, because there just isn't much of a younger crowd.
And thus enters FMH Lisa Butterworth. Who wants to give a quick little bio of Lisa and the founding of FMH?
I'll do that. So Lisa Butterworth, in 2004, she was a Mormon feminist without a sense of this whole Mormon feminist history. She just was a Mormon woman who was liberal. And it was also the 2004 election, so political stuff was definitely in the air. And she was also the mom of 3 kids under the age of 4, and she was a stay-at-home mom. And so that's a very immersive.
In Idaho, in
Boise, Idaho. And she had the internet, and so she found blogs like Times and Seasons and By Common Consent, and she was so excited to be able to connect with other people who saw some of these things the same way she did, or who could, help her work some of this stuff out. But as you mentioned, John, there wasn't really like a feminist focus or a women-centered focus. And she kind of liked the idea of starting something. And so she started Feminist Mormon Housewives.blogspot.com. And that was just sort of the beginning. She didn't feel like she was carrying on a torch or anything. She just wanted to talk about some stuff and not do it completely in her own head. She wanted to be able to connect with other people. And so her very first post on the blog actually was about VeggieTales, the animated cartoon that her kids were watching, and how frustrated she was at the way that all the female characters were portrayed there. So it was very, it was lighthearted. It wasn't taking itself too seriously. And that was sort of the starting point and the tone that Lisa set for the entire community that would eventually arise.
And what was her feminist awakening rooted in? Was it going to college? Was it learning stuff at, some university? Was it reading a book? What was it?
Nancy might be able to know more on this. I believe that it was simply the kind of like an accumulation of things. Feeling, when she was younger, like maybe people were saying things about feminism or about the civil rights movement that were disparaging, and not feeling like that quite felt right. And then learning things in college, and then going to church, and not feeling like it was all making sense. She had kind of gone through her own faith crisis prior to beginning the blog.
Love it.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, and I think it's important to realize that feminism doesn't just come from like books and going to college, but it's really that when you're a woman in a very conservative patriarchal tradition, that there's just a lot of conflict where your body is the site of that conflict, whether you want it to be or not. And so there's just a lot of experience. I think for her, a lot of it was just accumulated experience where, your body is kind of the center of tension, and you never really wanted it to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. Can you guys describe for us Lisa's writing style? As I was going back and reading her posts, and by the way, 2014 was a really important year because, I remembered I leave Microsoft in 2004. I come to Logan in 2004. I discovered Times and Seasons by Common Consent in 2004. And then, that's when Lisa starts Feminist Mormon Housewives. We have come so far in Mormonism in the past 14 years. And 2004 is probably going to go down as a really important starting point for all that. But as I remember reading Lisa's posts, they were so delightful. Talk about her style, and then I'll reflect on that. Who wants to talk about how she wrote, what her writing was like?
So a lot of it centered around like issues of motherhood and what she was encountering that was challenging in the church. Some of it was whimsical, like VeggieTales, and then there's also a series of posts that are referred to as the Poop Chronicles. And
which is what Poop Chronicles meaning what?
Just like stuff with your kids that goes wrong. Like when you're in that really intense period of parenthood, motherhood specifically, where it's just the kids' needs are overwhelming, and it's just an extremely intense period of time.
And usually those posts did revolve around poop, like some sort of diaper emergency.
Yeah. Right. And it's really difficult stage of parenting, of mothering. And in that time, there were just a lot of expositions of what that means. And then I think also combining those very lived experiences of motherhood with messages about motherhood in the church, that motherhood is supposed to be joyful, and this is the most wonderful thing that you've ever encountered. And the stark contrast of poop emergencies with the pedestalization of women and language around the pedestalization of women, right? They just don't mesh all that well.
Right. And the thing with Lisa's writing style is for one thing, it was usually very stream of consciousness. Not a lot of, punctuation or erasing anything and making it sound better, quote unquote better. It was just very much from the heart. I wanted to read one little paragraph as an example. It is on page 22 of the book. It's from a post that she wrote in 2005 called Proclamation Confession, where she was writing about why she didn't like the family proclamation. But the way she started it was, "Oh goodness, now the kids are in bed, the baby is done crying, I've cleaned up 10 pee spots off the floor. Why couldn't she just pee in one spot? I still have to do the dishes and clean the blue finger paints the 4-year-old found and Blue Man grouped all her dolls with." Like, it's just very much like, blah, here's some stuff that's in my brain and I'm going to get it out, and I'm not going to try to make it look pretty, but it somehow was so much more approachable and endearing when she's making up words and just letting things be. That really, it was very formative for the entire experience of like being at FMH.
Yeah, and that sense of raw emotion and recounting of experience is something that has definitely characterized like FMH writing over the decade that the book covers. Just you know, the rawness of it, the difficulty of it, the imperfection of it, but also the beauty that comes out of that accessibility and that, you know, just kind of spilling out onto the screen.
Yeah, it reminds me of Mark Twain's sort of Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer. Not that there were things that were grammatically incorrect, but it's just there's a casualness or a heartfeltness or an informalness about it that kind of lures you in because it's just kind of fun and folksy and vulnerable.
Yeah.
But that is not to say that it's shallow and non-substantive. It's extremely powerful and substantive. And so it's a nice 1-2 punch.
Yeah, it's true. And she would often really, you know, dive deeply into these subjects like the family proclamation or polygamy or whatever. And then she would sort of offset it, make it a little gentler by saying things like, it's just pure yuckiness, you know? So it wasn't all just intellectual like phrasing. It was like, here's my gut reaction. I hate this, you know? It's so that blend was just, it was just really impressive. I think it appealed to a lot of people.
So let's pause the narrative and let's talk about the creation of the book and how you structured it. And then we'll go a little bit through the book. Okay. So Sara, this was your kind of baby at first. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So the blog was started in August 2004. So in August 2014 was the anniversary. And I had been blogging with FMH for a year. I'd been reading it for maybe like 7 years. And I went to my other co-bloggers and said, what would you guys think of making a book? I'll like spearhead it. I just think it should really happen. What do you all think? And they all gave me their blessing. And so what I did was I started by reading posts that had been published in those first 10 years. And came to find out that there were over 4,000 of them, which works out to at least one every day, which was just incredible that a blog could exist for that long and be so disorganized. Like there was never any plan to any of it, but that it could be creating so much content and engagement. So I read through all those posts, and any that just stood out as being particularly meaningful or relevant or funny or insightful or whatever, I would just write them down in a Google Doc and just think, well, I'll revisit this list later and we'll figure out what actually should be in the book. And so it took me a few months to finish that project. Luckily, I was a stay-at-home mom at the time to just one baby who happened to be very chill. And so I had a lot of time to just read and read and read. And I had my final list and then cut it down and cut it down and cut it down to where I felt like it might be manageable as a book. And I really wanted to make sure there were posts kind of representing the important topics that Mormon feminism seemed to really care about, like motherhood, marriage, and including gay marriage and the whole wrestle that FMH went through during Proposition 8, things like modesty, things like sex and sexuality, just and many more. And so then I had that list, and after that there were so many stops and starts. I became pregnant for the second time and was very, very sick, and so I put it all on the shelf for a while. And there were just other things that came up that would kind of push the project forward and then make it stop. And so I thought it was probably just never going to happen. After I'd been working on it for about 3 years, I was like, this is just, I'm not going to worry about this anymore. It's been too much. But then about a year ago, I had known Nancy for a long time, but about a year ago, we connected over this project. And she said, I'll help you make it happen. Let's try to do this. And so over the past year, we just did a lot of emailing and a lot of, shared Google Docs, and eventually figured out how we were going to self-publish with the blessing of the Feminist Mormon Housewives board, and also with a lot of help from Joanna Brooks, who had self-published before herself and could tell us that like we really didn't need to freak out about it, like we could handle it. And so we had to cut down that list even more so to make a book that was a reasonable size, and we published it this past May.
Tell us the basic structure of the book.
Nancy, do you want to do that? I've been talking.
Sure. No, you're good. So we're just going through, so the book is there are 11 chapters, each for one of the years that we cover. So 2004 to 2014. And we were trying to take
Is that 11 years total?
It is, because there's a chapter for 2004 and 2014. And then, so even though it's 10 years, it's not perfectly lined up.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah.
But so there's a chapter for each year, and we tried to pick the best posts that represented the community responses to things that were going on that year, together with developing particular themes across the years. And that's which is something that's really interesting, that the same topics kind of kept coming up the way that they do in the fringe Mormon community, but each time they would come up, the community would develop them in that discussion further. So there's a chapter for each year, 2004 to 2014. Each chapter has a very short historical essay, kind of saying what was happening in the world and in the church during that time, and it gives some context for what the posts are about. There are also some essays at the beginning of the book. Sara writes a foreword, I write a little historical essay, and Lisa has a little kind of looking back on her founding and writing for FMH at the beginning of the book. And then at the end of the book, there are, I believe, 8 reflective essays by bloggers, people in the community, looking back on what Feminist Mormon Housewives and the blog meant to them. And we also have a whole bunch of notes. So it's set up like an anthology. It's not academic, it's self-published, but it's, very much trying to say, here's what we wrote about, here's what the development of our community and of our discussion, and how we track that year by year. But there are also lots of threads that go through that. Motherhood is a really important thread. Polygamy is a really important thread. And Lisa's first polygamy post, she basically says, I don't want to talk about this, and don't try and talk to me about this. Like, this is too uncomfortable for me to talk about. And of course, that's the first in a series of, many tens of posts on the blog and throughout the Mormon feminist community on polygamy. And so
that was FMH Lisa's ultimate polygamy post in 2005, right?
Something like that. There may have even been one before that, but there was a lot of resistance, and not only from her, from other people in the community. Where one thing that was great about the Mormon feminist community is that we just tackled a lot of really taboo topics. And so our book really begins to, follows the thread of some taboo topics, like the challenge of motherhood in the LDS Church, and how that motherhood appears in a variety of ways. Polygamy is another theme. Mother in heaven is another theme that gets that's followed through. Activism is a theme that is followed through, and really throughout the whole of the book, like at the beginning of the book, critiques of the church are very gentle. It seems and feels really radical. And this was true for me as a reader during that time, which is that anytime anyone says anything critical, it was like, and I certainly remember having that kind of internal reaction reading, like, do they know that they're not allowed to say this stuff? And really have that internalized fear of critique of the church or critique of our own experiences. But what happens is that as time goes on, the community normalizes that kind of critique and then gets better at critiquing, and then begins to bring in kind of an education process where we all get better educated in feminist theory and in our ability to critique and to kind of react to fairly standard critiques against feminism. And there's a very strong educational process. So one of the critiques of people who've participated in the community for a really long time is that we just keep talking about the same 5 to 10 things. And that's true. We do keep talking about the same 5 to 10 things, but every time we talk about it, we get smarter about it. And there are better and more inputs and more information. And I think that's really been a strength of the community. And I think we tried to bring that out in the book, is that these conversations really develop in significant ways as time goes on. It goes from like Lisa not wanting to talk about polygamy to Lindsay developing a podcast all about polygamy. So like that's a big change over a lot of years where we all learn and grow and that kind of thing.
And as if other parts of Mormonism don't talk about the same things over and over again, like progressive and post-Mormons talking about Book of Abraham and Book of Mormon historicity. I mean, that's been going on for decades, right?
Right. We all have our hobby horses.
It's true. And the thing is, it's the same community talking about the same stuff, but it's not the same people often. People kind of figure out what they need to figure out, and then they might move on. But in the meantime, more people are coming up saying, I just found out Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and so they still deserve to be able to talk about those things too. Right. And that's another element of it, is how you see new voices coming in, saying a lot of familiar things, but every time it's so sincere and it's so personal.
Yeah.
And this is something we see to this day. We've got people jumping in various Mormon feminist groups and, how do I critique modesty? We've been working on how to critique modesty for, 15 years now. And so those of us who've been around in the community feel like, modesty, that's an easy one. But if it's new to you and you've never pushed back against that before, then there's an educational process that needs to happen.
Love it. Other topics I wrote down my list of like categories of essays. There's being a working mom. Mm-hmm. There's patriarchy. The Proclamation on the Family gets talked about quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Sort of like defending feminism, teaching people about the basics of feminism, reconciling feminism and faith, the temple. You already mentioned sex, sexuality, and modesty, activism, LGBT stuff. And then towards the end, it's kind of really interesting. The 10-year anniversary kind of hits right when Kate Kelly and ordained women are really raging. So there's a lot of talk at the end about ordained women and excommunication and being silenced versus speaking out. And then also, wasn't there a bit of a racial awakening about an awakening about, racism and people of color and multiculturalism?
Definitely. Nancy, why don't you go ahead with that?
So yes, that does happen in the community, and that's been a huge theme of the community for about the last 3 years.
So that's more after.
Yeah, that's kind of beginning just about as the book is ending.
Okay.
And so that doesn't really become a fully fledged part of this particular book, but
that's volume 2.
That's right. It's for volume 2.
Okay.
Yeah, but there is a really important post that a couple of posts that end up in the book from Kalani Tonga, who is a biracial woman. Her dad is Tonga and her mom is white. And talking about being biracial and talking about being biracial in a largely Tongan community too. And so I think that there is, just like in the larger culture, there does start to be more of a willingness and a desire to open your eyes to issues of race and cultural differences that you can start to see little hints of towards the end of the book as well.
And we should mention that we invited Kalani and Gina Colvin to be on this episode, and both of them last minute had some glitches that made them not able to attend. So
yeah, and we miss them. We love both of them so much.
We definitely wanted to have them on. So our condolences to whatever made them so they're not able to come.
Get well soon, guys.
What's that?
Get well soon.
Yeah, get well soon.
Yes.
Okay, so let's do something that's probably going to be impossible to do. I've got a ton of questions just about, thoughts about the impact and that sort of thing. Let me start by saying, what do you think Lisa hoped would accomplish by creating this blog? And then did the role of it change in her mind and for the blog overall over time? Like with Mormon Stories, I started out like wanting to keep people in the church. Mm-hmm. And believing that if we talked openly about stuff, we could just work through it all and Mormonism would grow and thrive. And of course, things don't always end as you start. So with FMH, do you have a sense for kind of what her original goals were? And then if those goals or objectives changed, what they changed to?
I think they did change. I have my understanding of Lisa's thought process with it. And then also as she becomes not the only blogger and it becomes a group blog, then everybody else's goals with it too. And I hope I'm right. I hope I don't misrepresent you, Lisa. Basically, I think her original goal was she just wanted to make some friends. She just didn't want to be alone in this anymore. She wanted to be able to say what she thought, and she wanted to talk to other women that she thought were really, really cool about stuff that was important to them. And then as it became more popular and there was more of a community coming and there were people commenting that Lisa didn't know and whatever, I think then the goal and the tagline of Feminist Mormon Housewives became a safe place to be feminist and faithful. And it shares some commonalities with that whole idea you were talking about, John, of like helping people stay in the church, but I think more from a perspective of like helping people be okay in the church, like a person-centered focus of like, we want to make sure that you know, each of you individually, that it's okay to be a feminist and Mormon and that you can do it, and we're going to be here for you. And so there was a lot of difficulty trying to balance those two things. Like, what does it mean to be faithful? How feminist can you be and still have a temple recommend or still have a calling? How quote unquote faithful do you have to be really be a Mormon? Things like that. And that was the point, that was the posture of the blog for a long time. And I think it was really helpful for people when they felt like they needed some kind of community that really understood them and was a place of spiritual growth, but they couldn't really get that at church, but they were still going to church. They could still get that with the other women and some men on the blog and in the blog family. And then about the time of the 10th anniversary, and like you mentioned, ordained women and Kate Kelly's excommunication, I think that was the beginning stage of the creators and the steerers of the blog, the people who were running the show. I think that was kind of their first time thinking, is it really a good goal to try to be faithful in a way that the church recognizes? Like, what if you can't be faithful to the LDS church and still like live in alignment with your own values and principles? And so there started to be more of a willingness to say like, no, I don't go to church anymore, and I don't have a temple recommend, and I don't pay tithing because I don't feel like that would be correct. I don't feel like it would be noble of me. And at this point, the focus of the blog has changed from a safe place to be feminist and faithful to now the tagline is spreading the radically inclusive gospel of Jesus Christ. Oh, dog. Spreading the radically inclusive gospel of Jesus Christ. And so there is less of an emphasis on wanting to make sure people, are able to like still have a calling or whatever, and be acceptable in the church, and more just like, we need to focus on justice and love and the more inclusive approach, even if it's not particularly Mormon.
Kind of more radically Christian. And when I say radical, I mean roots, like the core Jesus gospel, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the goals really have changed, but it wasn't, it took a long time. The blog kept that approach for over 10 years, that original approach of feminist and faithful for over 10 years, and did a lot of good with it, I think. Served a lot of people. But then because of kind of these external forces, there seemed to be a great need to look more critically at whether that goal was worthwhile and sustainable.